Welcome, everyone. I'm Frank Conkling, and this is Panic Consulting's Deep Dive Workshop. And today we're going to look at why is parcel mapping so difficult? So difficult. It should be simple, right? It should be simple. Well, many of you know my background. I'm actually not just a GIS person, but I'm a GIS professional, but also I'm a professional land surveyor in 2 different states. I'm a professional land surveyor and mapper in the state of Florida, and I'm a professional GIS surveyor in South Carolina. And in addition to that, I've taught surveying and mapping at the local state college for about a dozen years. And I do a lot of talks, and I am a platypus. I am one of those strange creatures that lives in both surveying world and I live in the GIS world. And so what I'm going to try to do is fill in some, answer some questions about surveying techniques that can be applied to parcel mapping, and see if I can fill in some of the things that some of us are missing. Because I go around to all of our clients' offices and I see what they're doing, and I see the data, and I see so many of them having these gaps and overlaps, and they've got little slivers that have to be determined because they're not quite sure, because they think there's a problem in getting things to work out. And I try to go and make them understand that there's a certain way that they should be doing this. So what I want to try and do today is sort of talk about the complexity, why it's not so simple. Parcels are not simple. We need to all acknowledge that. Parcels are really complex. And there's several areas in which the complexity is introduced. First, there's this whole concept of ownership. We can own land, but really, what does that mean? And then I want to talk about something called a Livery of Seisen, and we'll explain more about that, what that actually is. Then I want to talk about the concept of monuments and what they are and why we should be looking for them. Finally, we're going to talk about the types of surveys that are still out there. Then interpretation of legal description. We're also going to talk about sequential versus simultaneous conveyances and remonumentation projects. So why don't we go and stop right here and just say that if you have a question that you'd like for me to stop and answer as we're going along, as we're going through some of these complex concepts, please put it in the chat window. Chris is here moderating, and he'll jump in and make sure that you get my attention and we answer these things beforehand. So we do want to make sure that this is an opportunity for us to fill in some of the missing areas here. All right, so what roles does parcel mapping play in this whole thing? And while a parcel mapper, a cadastral mapper, is not a surveyor, you kind of try to provide the same service as a surveyor would. Your goal is to locate the real interest as accurately as possible. Real interest basically is any sort of land interest in real estate. Somebody owns something. They have the ability to do something on it. And while you're not surveyors, you should try to use the rules that have been established and similar to what surveyors do as they go along. Let's talk about ownership issues and what it is. The first concept is we really don't own land. We do not own the actual land. We can't pick it up and move it someplace else and take it with us as if we move to another state or another city. What we do is we own the right to use that land, though. We own the right. And conceptually, when we talk about ownership, there's multiple levels of ownership. There's what we call a fee simple ownership. Fee simple means that you own as much as you could possibly own. You own all of these bundles of rights. You have the ability to go in and occupy and use the land. You have that right to do that. You have a right to build something on the land. You have a right to grant easements to it. You have a right to take out a mortgage on it, borrow money against it. You have a right to mine it and drill it and farm it. You have a right to restrict what others can do on it. You have a right to provide covenants on your land. You have a right to exclude others, and you have a right to sell it or refuse to sell it. You have a right to give away or abandon it. You have a right to lease your property. You have a right to license it or devise it by will, to grant it to someone else when you go and pass away. But again, these are rights. One that's not in here is the right to pay taxes. All right. That right to pay taxes is very important because most parcel mappers, most cadastral mappers, what you're really doing is you are mapping the rights of someone to pay taxes on. Most parcel mappers and cadastral mappers come out of property assessors' offices or property appraisers' offices, where they go and try to determine who's going to pay taxes on this property. So you have to figure out who owns that right to pay taxes. And it's not always the person who owns the ability to go and occupy and build and use. It might be someone who has the right to lease the property. But so just be aware, what you're actually mapping for the most part when you're a parcel mapper is you're mapping the right to pay taxes on the property. So let's talk about types of land ownership in here. There is the sovereignty. Sovereignty is for the most part the state or federal government, actually it's the federal government, who originally owned the land in the United States. But there are all sorts of areas in parts of the country, especially down here in Florida, where we've got Spanish land grants, we've got English land grants, we have all sorts of old land grants before Florida became a state. So that the sovereignty was always, it could have been the crown, the Spanish crown, or it could have been the English crown, or again, it could be the federal government, but there's always that sovereignty. And the reason why I introduce that or include that in there is almost 90% of the time when land is sold from the sovereignty to a private entity, that land has reservations on it. It's reserved so that that sovereignty can come in again and utilize it either for transportation or commerce or whatever. There's always reservations on there. Down here in Florida, we have mineral rights that are reserved all the time. The next sort of type of land ownership is a fee simple one in which you own all those bundles of rights on there. And then we come down to things such as an easement. An easement is a right to use the property for a limited use. A utility easement is a right for a utility company to use that property to do something. It doesn't give them the right to do other things. It only gives them the right that they were granted. So it's not a right to everything. If a landowner goes and grants an easement to a water distribution company, a water utility, so that they can put their pipes in there, that doesn't mean that a separate entity has the right to use that easement that was granted to that one water company. So those rights are exclusive to the grantee, and you just want to understand what the limitations on an easement right are. Leasehold rights. Leasehold rights basically are rights that are granted to an individual for a set amount of time. They are basically leasing that property. Another form of complexity when it goes into land ownership is percentage. You can own land and jointly with someone else. You can have a percentage of that land. joint tenancy, tenancy in entirety, tenancy in common or co-parency. These are all ways that you can jointly own land on here. And then finally, there is temporal ownership. This is where you only own the land for a set amount of time that's identified. So for example, there's timeshares. A timeshare owns the land, owns the right to use that land for a predefined amount of time. We're also talking about, well, let's expand on this. Things like condominium ownership. Condominium ownership is an individual right of ownership for a three-dimensional space. And then there's joint ownership in other elements within a piece of property. There's limited common elements, there's general common elements, so that it expands who has that right to use those elements on here. So don't let anybody ever tell you that land ownership and parcel ownership is simple. It is not. It is the opposite of simple on here. So Chris, I see that I have something in here. Vanessa's asking, when an easement says for ingress and egress, even though it's created initially for utility, is it giving others the right to use it? The easements themselves and the grant of that easement, basically, if they say it's an easement for utility purposes to this party, and then it says the right to install utility infrastructure and ingress and egress, it does not mean it granting ingress and egress to anybody else, only to that one party to that deed of conveyance. All right, so it would allow the person who installs that infrastructure to get in there and have access to the property and such, so that they could maintain that infrastructure, but it doesn't mean it opens it up to anybody else. That is sort of a private contract between the person who owns that property and the party of the second part, the grantee, allowing them to use it for something. Okay, so again, we're always coming back to, we only have the rights to use it. We have certain rights, that's it. So let's go back a little bit further and talk about, well, how do we convey land on here? And there's a concept called Livery of Seisen. Livery of Seisen really is sort of an aggregation of delivery of possession. And this is an old ceremony that used to take place. And this originated in England, so that when someone wanted to go and sell land or someone wanted to purchase someone else's land, what would happen is those two parties would go and meet on site. They would meet on site and acknowledge, oh, I'm the person selling the land, I'm the person that wishes to buy the land. They would meet there on site and acknowledge one another. And then the person who owns the land would go and actually walk around the property, pointing out to the person who was purchasing the land where the boundaries of that property are located. So they would walk around, they would say, we're going to start here, we're going to walk along the road until we get to this elm tree. And then we're at that elm tree, we're going to turn and we're going to go towards the river, and we're going to walk along the river walk along towards the river. Once we get to the river, we're going to walk along the river until we get to the stone wall. Then we get to the stone wall, and we're going to walk back to that point that we started at. So they would literally walk the entire boundary. When they would get there, back to the original starting point, the person selling the land would reach down and they would basically take some dirt in their hand, and they would take a twig or something growing on there, and they would hand it to the person who was buying the land. And then they would give it to him, and they would say, okay, I'm giving you this property, and in exchange, you're giving me something of value. All right? And with that offer and acceptance, that land was officially sold. And if you look at it, this actually comes down to And it's often referred to at the very end where they exchange the dirt and the twig as a turf with twig on there. This is actually a sign over on the right-hand side from the landing place of William Penn. And it says basically he stepped here, first stepped here in American soil, who proceeded to the fort and performed livery of Seisen. He took the key thereafter. He did deliver unto him a turf, one turf, and a twig, upon which the porringer with water and soil became part of. So this was actually the conveyance over to William Penn for Pennsylvania on here. So that whole ceremony, we never got rid of it. We still have it. When you think about it, our modern transactions when we're going to sell a piece of property is we will go and offer it for sale. We'll have someone who wants to buy it. And then rather than having the two parties go out and actually walk the boundary of the land, instead we hire somebody to do it. We hire a surveyor to go out and walk the boundary of the land and be our eyes and our ears and tell us what's out there. That's really what a surveyor does. He tells you what the condition of the land is, where it is, whether or not what it looks like in that whole thing. He goes and does that and provides that legal description for you. If there are no existing monuments out there, he actually places monuments out there for what it is. And once he then comes back and reports back, the attorneys then go and prepare that document saying, these two people, here's the deed, here's what it is, here's where it took place, where the property is located, the date at which we're going to execute this, a description of the two parties that are part of this contract. We're making any other recitations as far as what the limitations are or what we're trying to do. We're going to talk about the consideration, how much money is being paid. There's going to be a receipt that I've accepted your offer and I convey this to you, and then a description of the property. This is really, we're doing the same thing as Livery of Seisen on here. And we're still doing it. Sometimes we're using surrogates, sometimes we're doing it ourselves, but we're still going through this same process to convey land. We're getting back to mapping again. So what is the most important part? The most important part of this whole thing is the monuments that are referenced in that description. With a Livery of Seisen, it's the monuments that are pointed out. We're going to go along the road to the elm tree. Then we're going to turn from that elm tree and we're going to go to the river. Then we're going to go from the river and we're going to go along it until we get to the stone wall. Then we're going to go from the stone wall and follow that all the way back up to where we were beginning at. So that when we see a modern meets and bounds description, what happens is a lot of parcel mappers really focus in on what I've got highlighted here in red, the bearings and the distance of what that traverse was, what that courses were that were being described. But the reality is those aren't monuments. Those are basically just guides or hints to where those monuments might be. In this first paragraph, it says, north 89, 45, 47 west, 320 feet, to the point of intersection of the west line of Addition 1 to Gull Harbor, according to the plat thereof is recorded in Plat Book 4, page 24, the public records of Martin County. That's the monument. That's where you start. The bearings and distances are just sort of a guide, a help. And you literally could take that completely out of this description and it would be just as good a description. It would clearly say, start at the intersection of the west line of Addition number 1 to Gull Harbor. That's one of the important things that people don't realize is that the bearings and distances are just guides or aids to help you kind of figure out what the geometry looks like, but they are not the ones that really control where the actual property is located. And this is an area where we have a lot of conflict going on. So what happens when you have a conflict between information that's shown on that deed? It's calling a bearing and distance, it's calling a monument out. How do we figure out what's the important things and what's not the important things? And what you'll look here is, we're going to use this one piece of property as an example here as we go through. You'll look at this priority of calls. What's the most important thing that's on here? The top thing is unwritten rights. You might have somebody else using this property that owner may not be aware of. Unwritten rights are always the top level. You always want to be suspicious of that. As a mapper, we usually don't see those. Then we go down to senior rights, and we're going to talk about senior rights here in a bit. Then the next thing down is the written intent of the parties to that. What did you intend to do? And that's why the recitals of what's on that deed, what are they intending to do? I'm intending to go and sell you this property on here. That will control, because if you have a conflict up in that recitation, it may overwrite what's below it. There may be that conflict here. Number 4 on here is lines that are marked and run. If you have lines that are marked and run, now those marks, you've got to be able to go and say these are well documented what those lines are. It clearly stated what those are. The next thing comes down to, well, natural monuments. So in my description of Livery of Seisen, I was talking about going to the elm tree and then going to the river. Those are natural monuments, monuments that are occurring naturally, not something that's been put on by man-made. Those, if they are existing and if they can be proven, that's where that monument is. And that's where that corner should be for that property. After that would be original monuments, monuments that are called out and were set by the original surveyor, the original time when this thing was created. And then we get to record monuments. Record monuments are those monuments that we talked about here, the point of intersection of the west line of Edition 1. That's referencing back a recorded document. That's a record monument on there that you want to go and make sure that's the location. Then we go down further. What's the next thing that might be in conflict, and what's the next priority of calls? Then it comes down to occupation and possession. What's being used out there? Then, and only then, 9th on this list is direction and distance. It's way down on this list as far as when do you use direction and distance. And then if there's a conflict in that, distance is of a greater priority than direction. So it's all the way down, distance and then direction, and then area is next to the last as far as what you consider. And finally, coordinates. In most of the United States, we don't use coordinates on here, but we're starting to see some deeds and descriptions that are inputting coordinates on here. And the reason why you don't use coordinates very often is that coordinates are constantly changing depending upon what our datum is and how well it's documented and such on here. So this is the priority calls, and this is something you need to remember. When you get a deed and a description and there's a conflict, there are things that are helpful, but you don't hold them. And there are things that you hold no matter what going on here. So let's look at this one parcel. This is, and look at the upper right, the actual land description. It's a portion of the northeast quarter of section 14, containing 10 acres more or less, as shown on that certain survey plat dated June 9th, 1957, and recorded in book 12, page 14 of the county recorder's office. And if we look, the original survey plat was recorded in 1957. And it says here that, in fact, all those brown dots, those are property corners which were set by this survey. And that's important. When this property was created, that surveyor set monuments, and those monuments are the ones that control. Now, the original survey says that the east-west line was 660 feet. The north-south line is 660 feet. So when you're going through to look at this, we first look and say, well, does this legal description call out any natural monuments? No, no natural monuments at all here. Artificial monuments, yes, there's the artificial monument for these corners which were set by that original surveyor. Descriptions or linear measurements, yes, there are distances that we want to go and use if they're applicable. And then bearings of direction, no, we don't have any bearings in this description at all. And then acreage. So if we're looking at the priority of calls here, it is the artificial monuments which were set, and then the distances, and then finally the acreage. But what we have to remember is this, and this is very important. Measurements are never perfect. Distance measurements are never perfect. You can't get two surveys, never mind surveys, you can't get two people to go out and measure something exactly the same. There will be differences constantly. There's limits in precision. There's imperfect measuring tools. There's different terrain that's encountered. There's diligence of a surveyor. And that if you go out and you measure something now, it will almost never match what the original measurements were when those monuments were originally established. So always remember, distances should never be 100% relied upon. They are not perfect. So let's look at what happens subsequently to this parcel. All right, so the original one said the Andrew Adams survey, 10 acres. But then there was a retracement. Somebody went back in 1957 and retraced that original survey on here. And what they found was that the north-south distance was not 660 feet, as it said on the original survey. Instead, it was 625 feet. But they found that the monuments were original monuments. They were the exact same monuments that are in here. So to remember, the bearing and distance is not a finite value. It means just a direction or a guide to find that original corner monument. So what happens is when you went out and surveyed this time, or when you went out and mapped this time, instead of being 660 feet north-south, it's only 625 feet, which means that Adams only has 8.6 acres, not 10 acres, as was originally thought. Does that mean that you take that other 1.4 acres from the adjoining property? No, it doesn't. It means that the actual property is defined by the location of the original monuments, not by taking from somebody else. And what that brings in is that this concept of original surveys, original monuments, is very, very important. And that even surveyors have a hard time understanding this, and that unless a surveyor is, or unless a parcel is being created from something else or being cut out of it, most surveys are not to be establishing new corners. They are to retrace the footsteps of the original surveyors, the footsteps of the original person creating that. Where did they establish those monuments? So almost everything now, unless it's a brand new parcel getting cut or split out, is we've got to find where those original ones were. All right, let's talk about the types of legal descriptions that we have. Because the type of legal description really has a major impact on how you deal with these conflicts. There's really three types of descriptions that are out there. The first type is called an aliquot description. This aliquot is a French word meaning portion of. And in this type of a description, one acquires a proportional area of what someone else owns. So if someone describes this as being the west half of a parcel of land, you're actually acquiring a portion of that parcel of land. If the description, instead of saying west half, says the west 30 feet of this parcel, that's also an aliquot description because it's still a portion of something else. It's the western 30 feet of that parcel. So aliquot description goes back completely to what did that original person who's conveying this out, what did they own? Because you're only getting a portion of what they own on here. Very important to remember that with aliquot descriptions. The next type of a description is a meets and bounds description. Meets being the actual courses, bearings and distances that are called out on the legal description, and bounds being the monument calls to the surrounding property, along the road, then to the river, along the river, and along the stone wall. Those are the bounds. You could also have a record bound being to the property of Jones on this. So those are the bounds. So meets and bounds means it has something which describes a course, and then it describes the boundaries of it. But in a meets and bounds description, you want to pay special attention to the monuments that are called out in that description. And then finally, the third type of a legal description is a graphical description. Within a graphical description, if there's a conflict, you have to consider everything that's on that graphic. For example, are there dimensions that are omitted or have plus or minus signs on them? Or if there aren't, you then go and proportion any shortages or overages equally amongst those proportionally. All right, so let's look at this a little bit further. There's also a concept called sequential versus simultaneous conveyance. And this sequential versus simultaneous conveyance determines the distribution of overage or shortage. So you have simultaneous versus sequential, and then you have the type of description that's in there, and it just all flows down, and it helps you to make the decision, how do I go and map this? How do I figure out where this is supposed to be? So with a sequential conveyance, there's a lapse of time between conveyances. And the biggest concept with a sequential conveyance is that you can only sell what you own. If you don't own it, you can't sell it. All right. So, for example, over here on the right-hand side, we have a little sketch here. One says that the first parcel was conveyed out, and it was conveyed out as 100 feet. Well, it turns out that instead of having 200 feet like this person thought they actually only had 190 feet. So that the first parcel they conveyed out was the easterly 100 feet of that parcel. They go to the second person and sell it out, and that deed says the westerly 100 feet of this parcel, well, that person selling the property they didn't own the westerly 100 feet anymore. They only owned what was left of what they had originally. So that second person only gets 90 feet. They only get the remainder of what's left after those senior rights. Now, in simultaneous conveyances, this is when several parcels are created at the exact same moment of time, such as a regulatory approval of a subdivision of land or a certified survey map or some sort of division of land. In which case, if that occurs, you look at the whole portion of it, and each individual entity is entitled to a proportionate share of the overage or a proportionate share of the shortage on there. Let's explore this a little bit further and look at how this junior and senior rights can lay out. So in 1930, we have a deed. It says between the grantor and the grantee, for the sum of $350, he goes and conveys what's Exhibit A. All right. And so the guiding principle is the junior and senior rights is a simple one. The first owner out gets the full rights to whatever was conveyed to him or her, as stated on that description of land or a patent document. A patent is the original deed coming out of the sovereignty. But because there's a senior right, any gaps or overlaps created by subsequent written documents are junior to that first one conveyed out, and it has to yield to the first grant. So let's look at the first grant. In 1960, he goes and sells it out, and then in 2000, he sells out the remaining portion of it. All right, so here's how the parcels are described, and that's why this is important. Adams owns what he thinks is 10 acres. The first thing he sells out is the western 330 feet of the Adams parcel in the northeast quarter of Section 14, containing 5 acres more or less. He sells that out, and then later he sells out the east half of the Adams parcel as shown on the assessor's parcel AP 1103B, containing 5 acres more or less. So what should we be mapping on here? We get those two deeds, and if all we look at is the legal description on here, you say, well, there's a conflict here because we think this is 330 feet and it's as 330 on here. But the reality is, what happens if it's not? Because remember, this parcel is not 10 acres. This parcel is only 8.7 or so acres. So if we describe this out and lay it out, the first deed to come out of here says it's the west 330 of the Adams parcel in the northeast of the northeast. All right. So if we look at the priority of calls, the land description says the west 330. Are there any natural objects called? No. Are there any artificial objects called in the legal description? No. It doesn't call any monuments or anything in here. It just says the west 330 of this. There's a distance, there's no bearings, and there is an acreage. So that this property actually gets the westerly 330 feet of this property. It doesn't mean they get 5 acres. It only means that they get the westerly 330 of this property. All right. So what they will wind up with is 330 feet wide, but the property north-south is only 625. So instead of getting 5 acres, this first property with senior rights actually only gets 4.7 acres. They definitely get that westerly 330. So what happens with this? All right. So was then Mr. Adams' intent to sell his property is 330. It turns out because this was 660 wide, he got 330. But what would have happened if he had described this as the west half of that property? It would have depended completely upon how far apart these monuments were, how far apart these corners were in here. And if in fact, instead of being 660, that was 625 feet, and the property was described not as 330, but the western half, it would have then be instead that he would have wound up with lesser than 330 for the frontage. What about junior rights? So this second deed that came out in 2000, this went and described the land as the east half of Adams' parcel, shown on the assessor's map, containing 5 acres, more or less. No natural monuments, no artificial monuments, no distances, no bearings or direction. It just has acreage on it. So that what did he actually get? All right. By the way, the assessor's map is only a depiction, not a legal document. Please make sure you never reference a parcel on if you see any descriptions that references a parcel on a assessor's or appraiser's map, that's not a great legal description. So then let's look and see. So what is it that this parcel wind up getting? This parcel winds up getting that the eastern half of this property on here, but it's only 270 feet wide by 625 feet north-south. So they wind up getting not 5 acres, they wind up getting 3.9 acres because the interests are junior to what's already been conveyed out. All right. Junior and senior rights, this is a sequential conveyance. They sold it out sequentially so that sold out the first person, they got clearly what was on that deed. They sold out to the second person eventually, they could only get what was left, that portion of what they had left on there. All right. Sequential. All right. I'm looking at this and I'm thinking this actually should say simultaneous with proportional share. So within a subdivision, this is different because that land is divided up at the time that the recording of the subdivision takes place. It is simultaneous divided up. It's not sequentially, it is simultaneously all divided up. And it does it according to proportion. So in this case, this whole block of lots, the subdivision says is 250 feet total between the one street and the second street. But upon subsequent investigation, it only was 249.5, so that each of these lots only should get 49.9 feet. They should get a proportionate share of whatever overage or shortage is that's in here. And I will share with you, being on the Florida Board of Surveyors for over 10 years now, this is one of those things that most surveyors don't quite understand. They would say, well, the parcel, the subdivision says 50 feet. And they go out there, they immediately start measuring 50 feet without measuring the entire block and doing that additional work to see what proportion that overall lot should get. So I see Mark has a question. What happens if the distance was greater than 660 feet and the original owners still own a sliver of land? So Mark, and going back to this one here, this is very interesting because it's described as the east half of this parcel. All right. And so this subsequent owner gets half of the original size that Adams had, all right, that original Adams parcel did. But what happens, and you're right, what happens if there was something sliver between the 330 and that other sliver? It actually still retains in Adams. It's a strip that Adams would still own, because when they sold this property, if they wanted to do it correctly, they should have sold it out as west half, east half, or they should have sold it out as 330 and then all of this parcel minus the west 330. You always want to make reference to those previous conveyances when you're going and describing land. The other thing I want to go and point out here is that in writing legal descriptions, and I know most of you aren't writing legal descriptions, but in writing them and looking at them, it's extremely poor practice to describe land from two different points. So in this case, maybe the first parcel describes it as coming from the western boundary, and they describe 330 feet. And then they go to the eastern boundary and describe it as coming westerly 330 feet. That's really bad practice, because if it turns out that that's not 330 between them, you wind up with a sliver, or you wind up with that overlap that's on here. Those are really poor descriptions, and it's difficult. The saving grace is if in those descriptions, they say more than just the distance. They say maybe to the property conveyed to Brown in this case, or they have some sort of monument call in there that goes and references what that monument is. So there's all sorts of complexity in here when you're looking to interpret that legal description, you know, but be especially careful when you see sequential conveyances, because they are especially problematic. Don't just think it automatically fits in here. There's always research that has to be done to say, is that really what's left here? Sequential. All right. So on here, again, in this case, this block was shorter than it was supposed to be, and because the monuments may have been placed. An interesting thing on this is that the subdivision plat, originally, the subdivision plat was recorded after the surveyor went out and actually set the corners, so that they would set the corners, then go out there. They would set the corners, record what those distances were, and then that subdivision would get recorded. But in the sense of speed and trying to get things done as quickly as possible, that's been inverted now. And instead, the surveyors go out and they locate the overall parcel of land to be subdivided. And then they draw up where they think they're going to put those monuments, those original monuments, and then they put the monuments down after it's already conveyed and put of record. And often what will happen is where that subsequent survey comes in and he puts the monuments that are required by that original subdivision of land, they are not exact. So that rather than being, in this case, 250 feet between the monuments that are set on the block corners, it's 249.5. Again, you go back to what were the monuments that were established the first time that this property was sold, first time it was surveyed on here. And that's exactly why you wind up with these overages and shortages in the subdivision of that land. All right. And then you get things like this, where you've got property that has no division on it at all. And this, by the way, is a legal subdivided plat in here of an old subdivision. And you can see there's really there's no dimensions on here at all. There is a frontage for lot number 3, but nothing for 1 or 2. Nothing in here. You then have to go and look and see whether there's a recitation on the face of the plat that says all of these parcels are supposed to be X number wide. You know, most supposed to be 100 feet wide or whatever. But that's rare in old plats. And this, for example, I've gone and highlighted a couple things here. For example, block number 8, you're missing any dimensions along the western boundary to determine how big they are. Mark references these as paper napkin plats. And believe me, that happens all across the United States. Back in especially here in Florida, back in the 20s, the teens and the 20s, there was so much speculation going on that a developer would take a parcel of land, take a section of land, and divide it up and never record it. But they would start selling parcels out of it. And those development plans eventually became the official documentation for how these things were supposed to be split up. And it's not much more than what you see right here on some of these. These are just normal type of divisions. And it was mostly to illustrate where you were going to be, not what the exact dimensions were of those properties. Brings up another interesting point, though. This is a more recent subdivision in which none of the curves, none of these site corners are actually dimensioned. How do you know what they are? So from a surveying standpoint, what happens is because you have clear dimensions of the widths of the road frontage of this, but you don't have anything on those curves, all of the overages or shortages get thrown into those curves. Those ones that are not dimensioned, that's where all the excess or deficiency gets thrown in here on this. Another one on here where you've got questions as far as what happens if there's a shortage or overage in here. These are just old types of plats on here, but you still see this. These are some notes from a survey of what occupation the surveyor found, what monumentation the surveyor found on here. Trying to figure out what are they going to hold, what are they not going to hold, where, and again, I'm using a surveyor's terminology, but from a mapper's standpoint, where are you going to put the corner when you see this? It all goes back to where was the original monument placed? And some of the monuments are great. You see stone monuments, even if it's pile of stones. By the way, the one in the center, that's the types of monuments that we have here in Florida for the original public land survey system section corners. They were done in the 1850s, right after we became a state. And they are made out of the heart of a cypress tree. You use abundant materials, anything that you have available to you at the time. So what the surveyors would do is they would cut down a cypress tree, get down to the heart of the cypress tree, go and shape it, and they'd actually carve into it the actual location or what these things were supposed to denote. These are called lighter wood. This is a lighter wood post. Believe it or not, 250 years later, 150 years later, after that, they were originally set, you can still find some lighter wood posts out there marking section corners. In a lot of the counties, these have been replaced by concrete monuments, but in some of the more rural counties, you still find lighter wood posts out there. They've lasted 150 years and are still there. The other thing that we find, and this is the lower right corner on this slide, is we find where you'll have surveyors coming along after the original surveyor doing a retracement of something in a subdivision, and they'll all agree to within about a 3-inch ring, oh, we think it's somewhere in here. So they will establish their own new corner. Bad, 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 bad. This is what we often call pincushion corners. These are very, very problematic because the property appraiser never really knows. He knows within about 3 inches, but that's about it. These are the types of surveys that get brought before the Board of Surveyors in Florida. I can tell you on here. So let's talk about something to sort of build on this. This is a law that gets sort of drilled into the heads of surveyors as we're coming through and learning. Justice Thomas Cooley, he gave a presentation back to Wisconsin surveyors back in, I believe it was the 1890s. And this is commonly cited as something that surveyors should know. Basically, it says that surveyors, and I'm putting in there my emphasis that really mappers, are not and cannot be judicial officers, meaning they can't determine where the land is, but in a great many places, they act in a quasi-judicial capacity with the acquiescence of parties concerned. It's important for them to know by what rules they are to be guided in the discharge of their judicial functions. What rules should you abide by when you do parcel mapping? And I've included in here a link to, let me see here, a link to the actual transcript of Justice Cooley's presentation. There's some really interesting things in here. If you're interested, send me an email. I'll go and I'll send you a copy of the actual transcript on here. But for example, this is part of that transcript, and I'm putting in red here. And it says, Cooley says, there would undoubtedly be a presumption in such a case that a corner was correctly fixed by a government surveyor where the field notes indicated it to be. In other words, you have to rely upon that original surveyor that they said what they did. They did what they said they were doing. And if it called for a monument, the monument was placed in the right place. But as it says in sentence 2, there's only a presumption. And it could be overcome by satisfactory evidence that in fact, it was placed elsewhere. No statute shall confer upon a county surveyor the power to establish new corners that thereby bind the parties concerned. Nor is this a question merely of conflict between state and federal law. It's a question of property rights. This is the important part. The original surveys must govern, and the laws under which they must govern, because the land is bought in reference to those original monuments, and nothing else can change that. These were commonly called, Cooley is often cited and saying, well, what he really was saying is just let sleeping dogs lie. Even though the original monument you don't agree with, even though you find something out there that says, oh, no, these things were not mapped correctly, you want to make sure that you use the priority of calls to figure out exactly what you're going to use to figure out where something is located. All right. You want to look at what monuments were used with the original surveys. Then you want to look at what have the people owned? What about junior and senior rights? What about possession and occupation out there? Then you start looking at bearings and distances and area and coordinates on here. Which brings up an interesting thing, because I know there's several states out there that are going through what's been called a remonumentation project. You want to be very careful with this, because that remonumentation project really isn't reestablishing monuments. It's supposed to be finding where the original monuments were located. Okay, so let's go through these 5 different elements in here. This is from the Bureau of Land Management guide. The monuments of the public lands, when approved and accepted, are unchangeable. You can't change where those original monuments were located, even if the monuments are gone. Wherever they were established, that's where it starts building the rights from. That the original township section and quarter section corners must stand as the true corners which they were intending to represent, whether in the place shown on the field notes or not. The original monuments were established wherever they were placed, whether or not the dimensions that are shown on the original township plats were right or not. That quarter section corners are not established in the original survey. They shall be placed on the line connecting the section and quarter section corners and midway between them, except in the last half mile of section lines on the closing on the north and west boundaries of the townships. Those are called closing sections. You want to be careful when you're doing a breakdown on those. Fourth, the center lines of the section are to be straight, running from the monuments from one to the other. And then fifth, the fractional section, where no opposite corresponding quarter section corner has been or can be established, the center line shall be run from the proper quarter section corner as nearly in a cardinal direction to the meander line. If you've got a lake, if you've got water, you're supposed to run it in a cardinal direction, which means due east, due west, due north, or due south. All right, on here. So what does this mean for remonumented corners? The monuments used in the original creation of real interest must be used for mapping of the land. And again, we know in the upper Midwest, we've got some of our clients, they have had remonumentation come in, and these monuments have moved what they think or where they think the original section corners have moved from where they've been mapping from for a long time. So just because you get new monuments, it doesn't mean you move everybody's parcel on here. What it means is you look at the monuments that were used when that parcel was originally created. You look at what they occupy right now. You look at any other evidence for where their land interests are before you go and decide to remap them or move them. In other words, sometimes you use your old position that you thought that section corner was in, and sometimes, if it's a new deed, you use the new ones. So it's a very, very complex solution, but you have to remember that remonumentation corners especially are very, very problematic. As you come through and county surveyor gives you new coordinates on it, doesn't mean you automatically go and adjust everybody's property. You have to look at each individual property on them. This is one reason why there's a lot of talk about, well, now that we have the new corners in place, why can't we just do a least squares adjustment and do that? And the reality is you cannot do that. You can't do that because you have to look individually at every single parcel to figure out exactly what these people are occupying and what they're using and what they believe they own. So on another note, recently there was a Belgian farmer that was out mowing and not mowing, he was tilling his farmland, and he came across this monument. It kept him from going and tilling his land. So what did he do? He moved the monument, picked it up and moved it. Well, it turns out that that monument was the monument between Belgium and France. So the question is, when he moved that monument, does that mean that he actually moved the country boundaries between these two? No, it always goes back to not where the original monument is at the current moment, but where was it originally placed by the original surveyor? Not where the monument is now, but where was it originally placed? So I see that Karen has a question. So what if the original monument was moved by a neighbor and a new surveyor had to place another monument, but the neighbor put up a fence where the monument was supposed to go? Oh, isn't that fun? The reality is that, again, it's not where the monument's been moved, but where it was originally placed that should control where the actual land ownership is on here. It's where the original monuments were placed, because it always goes back to finding that original monument, finding that original intent. Where should this thing be? And I'm going to, hopefully you don't get sick by this, but I'm going back this again to look at this priority of calls. Are there unwritten rights? What about senior rights? Did somebody else already buy that land that's now being sold again? What about the written intent of the parties? If you read the beginning of a deed, does it say, I'm intending to sell all the land in section 29, but it goes on and describes land in section 28? That means that none of that land in section 28 gets sold, because the original intent, the written intent of the parties was, I'm selling what's in section 29. The lines that are marked and run, if you can find evidence, those original lines that are in there. And then natural monuments that are called, original monuments that are set, record monuments that are referencing to record information, occupation. What are they on right now? How long have they been on that property that you've got there? Then, and only then, do you go and use the direction and the distance. And then if it's a conflict between them, it goes to distance and then to direction, and then finally area and coordinates. So we have a question. Can you give an example of an unwritten right? I could tell you one in Florida here. So if in fact, in Florida, there's a lot of waterways, all right? And the sovereign, when they conveyed, when the property was conveyed out, it's always conveyed subject to the right of the public that's been long established. So that along the ocean, for example, oceanfront property, if the public has gone and they have used a path to get from a public road to the waterfront, and they've used that for a prescribed amount of time, in Florida it's 21 years, for a prescribed amount of time, and they've not been stopped from using it, then in fact, the person who owns that property owns the right to use it, subject to those unwritten rights of the public to walk across that property to get to the ocean, because they've used it for so long. It's not written anywhere, but there is long-standing usage of that, and there's evidence of usage of that. And we have that all up and down in Florida, all along the coastal areas. Over in Palm Beach right now, there's a big legal fight going on because that exact situation. There's a public road with public parking on it. And the general public has been going and parking there and then getting out of their car and walking down this path to go to the ocean. And it wasn't stopped for a long time. Well, recently, the owner of that property put up a gate. And it's being fought in court right now, saying, we have evidence that they've been using this for 30 years. You can't stop the general public from using it. That is an unwritten right of the public. So that when that surveyor goes out and locates that land, they better be on lookout for unwritten rights. Usage of a property, long-standing usage of a property that's open and notorious, and that gets into a whole other thing for adverse possession, but open and notorious usage for a long time on there. By the way, that public beach access, that's in Palm Beach, the town of Palm Beach. So yeah, that's sort of one of those things where even though you may have a deed that says you own this property, it's still subject to other unwritten rights. If somebody else has been using it for a long time, even if they may not have a deed that says they can use it, there's all sorts of complications built in there. So your priority of calls, you're always, if you're out there looking, it's always subject to the unwritten rights, and then subject to the senior rights, and then the intent and lines marked and things like that. So this is a good example of sort of a filter. How you go through this. Is there any evidence that somebody else has been using this property or somebody else is claiming this is their property? And then what about senior rights? Is this junior or senior rights coming into place here? What did the parties to that deed intend to do it? Are the lines actually marked and run? Are the natural monuments called in the description? What about original monuments that were originally placed? Are they in there? By the way, natural monuments, rivers, they change all the time. As the water goes through, there's erosion, there's accretion, lands coming back and forth. Natural monuments, they are very, very problematic. The original monuments that were set. What about record monuments referencing a document, a record, public record? What about occupation and possession, direction and distance, direction, areas, coordinates? All right. So as you can see, most of this goes back to, let's find what the condition was when this thing was first created. That first creation of that parcel, that's important. Let's get back to that original monument. The original monument in here, that's the one that's important. So I'm going to ask this, maybe instead of being parcel mappers, maybe we should instead start calling ourselves forensic mappers, because that's sort of what we should be doing. We shouldn't just be taking a deed and saying, well, there's bearings and distance on here. Let's go and map it out. And oh, there's a problem with it. Well, how do you resolve that conflict? You only resolve the conflict by looking through the evidence that you have in front of you. And you have to do some research sometimes. It's not always evident to you. Why is there a problem? What is that conflict on here? What do you want to look at? Those sorts of things. All right, that's actually the last slide. Hopefully you've enjoyed the workshop. Are there any questions on here? Any other questions? If not, I'm going to draw this to a conclusion. I want to thank everyone for going and attending. Let's stick around after I stop the recording and let's answer other questions. Thanks. Thanks for attending, and we hope you enjoyed this workshop. If you have questions, would like some more details about anything we discussed during this workshop, or if you or anyone at your organization would like information about training, support, or ways in which we can help you with your GIS needs, please contact me at frank@pandaconsulting.com or call me at 561-691-3277, and we can discuss how we can help you with your needs.